What is America famous for?
In Britain, I'm afraid, the Sputnik fiasco.
In Pakistan, America is famous for its generosity. I'm from South Africa, and there America is famous for its policy. America for the Americans.
I'm from India, and I think in India, America is mainly associated with anti-communism.
Let me introduce you to four of the 1958 group who are participants in this discussion. First, here's John Herald of the United Kingdom.
Hello.
John, tell us a bit about yourself, will you?
Well, I'm from one of the outer suburbs of London. I graduated from my high school last autumn, and next October I plan to go up to Oxford where I'm to study politics, philosophy, and economics. By the way, my father's a trade union leader.
And Rena Tom from South Africa. Rena, what have you been doing in the last few days?
Oh, we've had a wonderful time up to here, seeing places as Rockefeller Center, and of course, for the first time in my life, I've seen snow falling.
Glad we could produce that for you. Nyla, from Nyla Ahmad from Pakistan, what have you been doing?
I've also had a wonderful time, and I've gone up the world's tallest building, the Empire State Building, and saw the whole of New York from there.
Nyla, I had a letter from your mother that came just about 10 minutes ago, and she complains that she hasn't had a letter from you yet. Have you written home?
To tell you the truth, I didn't have time.
Oh, but you must, or they'll wonder what we're doing to you. Here's K.R. Krishnan from India. Krishnan, how come we call you Krishnan, and yet it seems to be your last name, since your first initials are K.R.?
Oh, well, Mrs. Waller, we in South India do not have first name, last name, family name, etc. For example, my initials are K and R. The initial K stands for my native village, Komandor. Perhaps it's non-existent now. And the initial R stands for my father's name, which is Raman. And Krishnan is my own and only name.
Have you got a nickname?
Well, you can coin one if you want to.
I'm sure we will before these 3 months are over, Krishnan. How was it like in your first host school? What was the first day like?
I have been impressed with the informal friendliness of a small town. That's Westwood.
You felt that already? Hmm?
Yes.
I'm glad you felt
I'm
that.
sure that's the first thing that a stranger feels in this land.
Well, that makes every American feel good. Now, John, come back to you. You said that America was famous in Britain right now because of the Sputnik fiasco. Would you like to explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
I stress to start with that I am expressing the popular misconceptions and not my own opinions here. To start with, Sputnik aroused a real joy in the heart of the average Britisher, I'm afraid. It symbolized the humiliation of the United States, and I'm afraid just at the moment, America is pretty unpopular generally in Great Britain.
John, I don't understand it. What kind of an alliance is yours with USA that you feel, I would say, you gloat over her humiliation?
Well, to start with, we're not discussing things as they should be, but things as they are.
Well, anyway, will you go ahead and tell us frankly why United Kingdom is pleased with America's humiliation?
Well, that's quite a big question. You see, I expect that most of you realize that there is a fairly strong sort of liberal trend throughout the whole of Western Europe, which feels that some of America's policies are perhaps dangerous, they are adding to the Cold War situation, and that trend, as I said, is general throughout Western Europe. Now, in Britain, we have even more reason, or even more explanation for these prejudices, because we quite honestly tend to look upon America as the amusing, the immature offspring of Great Britain, and suddenly, overnight, you have come up, our empire's gone, we're almost a second-rate power, and you are the people who are so close to us, we're almost our offspring, who've done this to us, and psychologically, it's pretty difficult for Britain to take, and for that reason, there is quite a strong sort of psychological resentment from the right wing in Britain, as well as the general sort of liberal and left-wing resentment of American politics.
Well, you admit that it springs from a sense of defeat?
Not exactly defeat, I would say, but a resentment that we are being challenged to prove.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nyla, could you tell us something about your image?
Well, that's a big question. Well, in Pakistan, we had we think the Americans are very generous people,
mm-hmm.
but actually we must remember that this I'm referring is to the aid, the American aid, but we must remember, of course, that America can afford it, and they have their own reasons. That is, they don't want the undeveloped countries of the world to go to Russia for help.
I think this conflicts quite strongly with the points which Rena was bringing out. Rena said, in effect, that in her country, America was typified by the America for the American sentiment, almost an isolationist feeling. Now, in Western Europe, and apparently in Pakistan as well, we feel that America is almost interfering in the internal affairs of foreign nations. Could you comment?
Well, John, I wouldn't say that is quite that quite applies to South Africa. Perhaps, as I know what you're steering to, the race problem. And, well, I think that each country, as America, has the right to try to solve its own problems.
Well, I'm wondering how far that is merely a sort of defensive attitude on your part. You don't wish to discuss this problem too deeply, and so you play on the national independence line.
Oh, no. I can, really, we can talk about that later on, but I think that each country and the people in each country, as they live there, know best how to cope with the different situations.
Well, we could discuss this all night, and I would love to, but maybe next program. Could you arrange that?
As I was saying, the general trend of opinion in India was to associate America with anti-communism. I would like to qualify this statement a bit. I would rather say the anti-communist complex. Would I be correct? Let me tell you something about my image of America. Briefly, this. It's a nation born out of factions and dissatisfaction. I think it's the result of religious ferment and moral indignation. It is the product of a transitional world when the impact of new ideas was changing the face of the world. And I must say that it's based on a new concept of democracy, based on the dignity of individual freedom. And I think it's unique in that its background is diverse. And the cultural heritage is also mixed, I should say. And from this unique background has sprouted an amazingly original blend of US culture.
But one point I'd like to take you up on straight away. The impression I had when I came to this country, from reading, from friends who'd been here and so on, was of a nation of extreme personal friendliness, but at the same time of broad social intolerance.
Well, I was coming to that. I should say that I must confess to harboring a few prejudices against America too.
Of course, we will do.
I should say that progressive ideas, thank you, have become mistaken, or I should say, progressive ideas have gradually changed into a brash irreverence for tradition, all traditions. And I should say there is a general craze for novelty, for the mere sake of novelty, to the detriment of a mature perspective. And I think the craze for excitement lingers on, as is obviously evidenced by Hollywood, horror comics, and rock and roll.
Well, Krishna, I don't quite agree with you on that. You know, for even when Johann Strauss first introduced his waltzes, I think the same clamor aroused that is now rising against the rock and roll.
But can we... I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, never mind.
I was going to say, can we seriously put modern American rock and roll on the same level as Strauss? I mean, I admit there's plenty of exceedingly good modern music, but can we count popular American music in that class?
Oh, we couldn't, but what I was going to say is that there's constant development in this world, and every new sign of development is, well, some people rejoice at it and others don't want it. And I think that's perhaps the same that is going to happen with rock and roll. And if it is accepted, then it must be a good thing, and it must be in the common taste of all. And if it's not, well, then...
Well, Nyla, what do you think about rock and roll?
I don't agree with her there. I mean, what about the horror comics? Everyone reads them, but they certainly aren't good.
Well, you know the statement, to err is human, forgive divine. So we might consider that as one human error. Perhaps that would still show.
Nyla, you must have something to say about American films.
Oh, yes. I must say, from the films we gain an idea that the Americans think that their religion is the best. And that is that they show a lot of religious intolerance. Now, for example, there are lots of films that come into Pakistan. I don't know how the government of, the USA allows it, because they, I should say, bring down their own prestige in our country.
But one wonders
Now,
on the other
now,
hand,
just a
how they
minute.
could stop them.
Well, I don't know. I suppose they're free. So, a film in particular is the life, love and adventures of Umar Khayyam, which completely ridiculed the man. I mean, or they picture him as a person who loves women and wine and song, which is completely different from the main.
Well, I think there is a bit of a danger on the part of a new nation being oversensitive. I mean, since I've been over here, I have been ridiculed the whole time by Americans for my accent. I mean, everybody imagines we live in castles and have bachelors and so on and so on. And not only that, but from these sort of old Hollywood movies we see on television some evenings, this, I think, appears to be a fairly general attitude. Now, at times it amuses me, at times it grates a little bit, but I don't think we need to make too much of it.
I should say it's only a case of a freedom abuse, as all freedoms are abused.
Cool.
What do you think of it, Rina?
Well, I've already expressed my meaning on my point of view on music, and I don't know.
But what about films, Rena? What American films do you see in South Africa, and do they do a good job for our country or not?
Well, we see most American films that travel around the world, and I haven't had much opportunity of seeing all of them, but as I have heard, it seems to me that it's quite accepted by the people.
And yet Nyla's criticism is a deep and trenchant one if she says that the films we send to Asia seem to make fun of Islam and the other Asian religions. Would this be true in India?
Well, Mrs. Wallace, first I must say that I don't go to see films often. Well, I see films once in a year or thereabouts. So I cannot presume to be an expert on this question.
I wonder, Mrs. Waller, I don't think it is done with the intention that Nyla sees it. Perhaps it's another error, perhaps.
I think it's one of the great dangers of democracy is that they're slow-moving, that they tend to move in all directions at once, that they make mistakes. We must admit that it's the price we pay for our freedom, but at the same time, I think we must recognize that danger. I mean, the Soviet Union directs their propaganda most beautifully towards every nation in the world. We get cultural exchanges, the best Russian films, those things which are going to appeal to the people, those things which are going to appeal to the intellectuals. It's the most beautifully coordinated plan, and I think there's a great danger that the Americans are exceedingly lavish. They splash money around like mad with their information service, but I wonder what real value they get out of it, and how much of the impression of America which one gains is from these cheap and trashy films which are obviously going to be far more popular than a more serious film.
Well, John, do you mean to say that the price for democracy is a certain loss of efficacy?
Yeah,
You say that?
I would go as far as to say that.
I think we should all be willing to pay that price.
Yeah, I say we should be willing to pay it, but at the same time, we should A, admit that that is the price we are paying, and B, be working all the time to cut it down. I think if we just revel in it, we're going to get into trouble.
But I don't think any of us here are in support of a rigid system. We all prefer the flexibility of democracy.
Oh, sure.
Yes, that's right.
But there was a point I think John almost was going to make, and then was interrupted with Nyla when Nyla said, how does the government, the American government, allow such films to be sent abroad? You were about to make the point, I believe.
Yes, but one could hardly sort of support a system of censorship of the films which are sent abroad, but maybe at the same time the American Information Service could do a better job coordinating some of the films that they would like to see sent abroad. I mean, where you can't do the negative thing by censorship, perhaps you could take the positive side by officially sponsoring certain things that you want to be shown abroad.
Do you say the state should associate itself with the film industry?
No, not directly, but I mean, at the moment, of course, there is a big propaganda machine, if you like to call it, run by the United States, run by every government, of course. And I'd say that the United States is spending a very great deal of money on this, and it's the most important thing that they should spend a lot of money on it. But I wonder at the moment how much value they are getting for their money.
Let me ask you a following film. Excuse me, Rena, for interrupting, but what other things form your impression about America? Tourists, for example, or Americans that are in your country.
Well, I think I should say something about that. We've had a lot of evidence of American manners in our country. I'll give you a little example. There was a distinguished gathering at a big party, and there was an American lady who asked her son to go to bed. She had a shrill voice, and there were lots of guests across the table, and she told him to go to bed. And you know what he did? He repeated his mother in the same voice in front of all those guests. It's really shocking.
Well, you take that to be representative of American way of life?
No, you can't generalize like that. But I think that mostly the American children are given too much freedom. Don't you agree? And they don't make use of the freedom properly.
Well, I mean, well, working again on insufficient evidence, of course, I do tend to agree with you. I mean, one sees, for example, this absolute freedom that the American child has, and he appears to do nothing very much except drive around in his car and go out dating. And
well, I am rather inclined to think, John, it's a question of difference in the concept of discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I mean to say, the American concept of discipline is not so rigid as it was in England during the Victorian era.
Yeah.
I am rather inclined to think that this is a kind of discipline based on mutual need and understanding. I shouldn't say that American children are disrespectful to their parents. No, I think it's, you might call it a kind of familiarity, or I should
Now,
say...
wait a minute, Krishna. Now, how can you be familiar with your parents, but at the same time you have to jolly well respect them?
Well, it exactly, the exact, means it all hinges on what you consider as respect. Would you be so insistent on formal demonstrations of respect?
Surely not. Now, Mrs. Waller is a woman I respect most deeply, and I mean, when I first arrived in the States, we were staying in college with her, and I saw her children of 6, 7, something of this age, speaking to her as Helen. And I'll admit that, quite frankly, it shocked me. I wasn't used to it. But then I saw that how this family was run after a couple of days. I saw who in the last analysis was boss, and I saw those children behaved as well as any English children would do, and that they knew if they were really told to do something, they had to do it. Now this, I think, is excellent, and I respect it very much indeed. But I wonder, can I just finish with one point, I'm sorry. I wonder how typical that is, when once you've lost the formal discipline, in a less intelligent family, possibly you would very soon lose the respect as well.
Well, let me tell you one thing. My contacts with some of American family, I have had some interesting experiences too. I was rather surprised when the boys were quite frankly discussing the problem of dating with their mother. I was really surprised. What would you feel if the same thing happened in your country?
Well, first of all, we wouldn't dare.
Exactly.
We just wouldn't dare.
What would that be in England?
Well, I think in that particular respect, we are better off in England. I mean, in my own family, if I wished to discuss that sort of problem with my parents, I'd feel quite free to do so. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to unless it was absolutely necessary. I think it's important that as a child matures, he should be prepared to make his own decisions, to make his own breaks. He's got to break with his family gradually. And if, as I think it's pretty typical with American kids, they run to their parents, it's not so much for advice, but to notify them about every single thing. They appear to discuss dating all the time with parents and friends. It seems to me that they're not so much leaning on their parents for direct advice, but they are leaning on the family as a unit.
Well, let me tell you one thing, John. The age of adolescence is one of the most critical stages in one's life. I mean to say, your expanding maturity doesn't keep pace with the full impact of the new experiences that you may undergo. I should say, in such cases, it's likely to get confused, and it will be extremely invaluable if you go to your parents and ask them for their guidance. Don't you think that this is a sign of boldness rather than of cowardice and the helplessness, as you mean to say?
Yes, I'm quite sure. Especially when the American children have much more freedom than the English children. I wouldn't call it, fussing over their parents. I mean, going and telling them everything. I think it's awfully bold.
Well, I don't quite know. I mean, I think it's bold and it's good that they should have the right to approach their parents. They shouldn't feel, as I gather you would perhaps, a little afraid to approach their parents on problems of that nature. But it is very easy to tend to lean too heavily to discuss absolutely everything with parents, not even to get their permission, but merely to feel a social compulsion, not a physical compulsion, to discuss it with the family. I think it's important for a child, as he matures, to begin gradually to make the break.
Now, wait a minute.
Give Rena a chance first. She's been trying to get in here.
Well, I agree, but I don't think that it is a lack of discipline in either way. I think that American children should be admired for doing so, and that it shows that they trust their parents to such an extent that they can discuss their, well, that is, of course, a very delicate affair, and that just shows to what extent they trust their parents, that they even want their guidance in such affairs.
Well, we were talking something about the need for social intercourse, isn't it? I should say that's the human need, and more so for an adolescent. And what better refuge can there be for an adolescent than his own parents?
Well, I think possibly we're talking of cross purposes. I mean, I agree entirely that it should be there. This last resort, this harbour in a storm, should be there. But I think American children tend to lean too heavily on the family. They feel that, not that there's any physical compulsion, but sort of socially they must discuss this all around to show how free and uninhibited they are.
Excuse me. Before we go further, can you tell us your image of American family life first?
Ooh. Well, provided one has an intelligent American family, I feel I have a very great respect for American family life. I feel there is an informality which is greatly to be desired, and which we are beginning to copy in Great Britain. But all I'm saying is that I'm afraid that it may easily run to excess in a less well-educated family.
Well, you're saying that the parents should be a last resort of a boy
Yeah.
or an adolescent, but I should think that the parents should be the first resort.
Could I ask you, perhaps, you and Naila Krishnan come from very traditional societies. Is the pattern of your family relationship changing at all?
Well, I shall tell you this much about my own family. I and my father do often engage in discussion on controversial subjects, and I think it's my privilege as an adolescent to disagree with my father. But I should say that I have a deep and abiding respect for him.
If he hadn't wanted you to come to America, could you have come?
Well, that's a hard choice. Anyway, let me feel glad that you didn't object.
I don't want to cut off. Perhaps you have another discussion on family relationships, but I've been sitting here wondering, seeing the difference between the statements you started out with and what you're saying now, whether any of your preconceptions about America have changed at all since you've been here.
Well, at first, I was also against rock and roll and movies and everything. And I thought, as some of these delegates do, I thought that it was due to the lack of discipline. But now I begin to think that America is entering a new era, and therefore is entering a new way of living. And with this new way of living come different things that we might not be accustomed to. But I think the rule of the forum might apply here too. Difference does not mean worse. And therefore I think that we as foreign guests should really respect this American way of living and try to see it in the right light.
Well, I feel, Mrs. Fowler, that we haven't yet had time enough. We were staying for 1 week at Coba House, and mostly we were confined to our own restricted society. And now we have been attending American schools for 1 day, isn't it?
Well, a couple of days anyway.
Well, that doesn't make a great difference.
Twice as long as you.
Well, so I don't think, in all fairness, we should be expected to answer that question at this stage. But I would be very interested in knowing what impressions you have when I say India.
Well, that's only fair. We've been asking you your impressions of America. How about it?
Well, these delegates have had, I don't expect them to give their opinion from first-hand knowledge. They haven't yet been to India.
No, but just a quickie. When he says the word India, what do you think of, Nana?
The fate of 100 million people depend on India.
Kashmir.
That's right.
Well, I regard India as being one of the great hopes for freedom throughout the whole of Asia, and one of the great hopes for peace throughout the world.
Krishnan, what do you think of when somebody says India?
Well, I should start out by saying that perhaps I'm not very modern.
Quickly in a phrase.
It's the bridge between the East and the West.
Bridge between the East and West. Now can we go to Great Britain? What do you think of when John says Great Britain?
Exactly the opposite of what I think when I hear the word America. Well, whilst for America the rule applies America for the Americans, I think to Britain it applies the world for Great Britain.
Well, I should say Britain finds herself in the most galling position of being forced by its colonies to realize to realize that her policy of colonialism is outdated and outmoded.
How about you, Nyla? Your turn.
Well, I would say that Britain is a country which has lost its power among the great countries of the world and will never admit it.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Wait a minute. Let's go to South Africa. What do you all think of when Rena says South Africa?
well, let me hit back now and be a bit nasty. With regard to their racial policies, I would merely say to her that when you are marching out of step with the rest of the army, it's time to look and work out whether you're out of step or the army's out of step.
Nyla, what do you think of?
A country which is trying its best to solve the racial segregation.
I'm sorry to say this, Rena. I think it's mockery of democracy.
Yeah.
And I think to the world it means nothing, but to me it means the world.
We're going to get on to Pakistan, but would you like to have a later discussion in this series on race relations in South Africa?
Well, I think
Would you like that, Rena?
Yes, and
I think we haven't yet had a chance to give our impressions about Pakistan.
No, quickly, Pakistan. What does Pakistan
I
mean to
think
you?
it should realize the danger of its communal outlook and opportunist foreign policy.
Rena?
Kashmir.
Kashmir again, John.
A, I'm sick of Kashmir, and B, again on insufficient evidence, I regard Pakistan's foreign policy as being pretty opportunist myself.
What does Pakistan mean to you, Nyla?
My home at last.
I'm sorry, this is a fascinating adventure in preconceptions that words give you. Our time's up. I'm sorry. We have to leave you now until next week at this time.